Okay. All right. I'm recording the session. So welcome back. All of you had a delicious lunch. And hang on. I'm getting lost who's who here. Horace, can you check and make sure everybody else is muted? Oh, sure. I would love to make you the host. It's what I live for. Okay, but then you have to make me a co-host. You'll think about it. That's not nice. Funny, but not nice. All right. So I see Pete and I see, who was the other person I saw a moment ago? Stuart is on, but I didn't see Kyle. Kyle, are you on? Nope. Okay, well, we'll start without Kyle and then he'll join us when he can. So welcome back. And this session is facilitation from other perspectives. So this is an idea that came to us at last year's workshop when we had a visual analytics faculty member on a completely unrelated panel. And as I was listening to him talk about stuff, I thought, you know what would be really interesting would be to hear the perspectives of people who do something similar to research computing facilitation, except not in research computing, in other areas of research facilitation, and get a chance to pick their brains on how they do facilitation within their area. So what I want to do is, for our panelists, I want each of you to introduce yourselves. So say your name and your institution and what area you're representing, and then give us, you know, the 30-second version of your biography. Go ahead first, Fanny, because you're in the room.
Okay,
you win.
Thank you. First, my name is Mariofana Milanova from University of Arkansas, Little Rock. And first, what I want to say, I want to thank Henry, Debbie, Dana, and all the organizers of this wonderful event. Okay, give a hand.
Oh, thank you.
Wake up. Yeah. So, my area of research is data science and machine learning, and really I have a very hard time to go to different researchers and talk with them, like people from bioinformatics or physics, because right now it's so popular. My degree is actually, I have a master's degree from Cambridge, England, in artificial intelligence. And after that, I study visual computational perception and visual perception, neurocomputing and neuroscience. And right now, I'm professor in computer science. But at the same time, I also, maybe this is part of the part, that when you want to convince somebody, you really sometimes need to put some titles, like title of I'm NVIDIA Deep Learning Institute Ambassador and NVIDIA Deep Learning Certified Instructor. So the question was something more about?
No, I think that's a great start. We're going to introduce the other, or the other panelists will introduce themselves, and then I got a list of questions. And then at any time, we are not married to the list of questions, as always. So if you have questions, or if you all just want to go off on a tangent and talk about fascinating stuff, the list of questions is purely a guideline in case we get stuck somewhere. All right, so I'll turn to Stuart. And Stuart, you want to introduce yourself and say where you're from and talk about a little bit about yourself and the area that you represent.
Okay, hi, I'm Stuart Levy. I work at NCSA at the University of Illinois in Urbana, and I'm a programmer in a group that does, well, it doesn't seem quite apt for this panel, but what we do is we talk to a lot of researchers and use data from them, sometimes simulation data or sometimes observed data, but often physical somehow, and make animations for public outreach, like for films and planetarium shows. So the group is a mixed group of programmers and artists, and I'm one of the programmers. And it's led by the artist Donna Cox. And maybe that's a good start.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Really appreciate it. And Pete, how about you go ahead?
I'm Pete Schlaps. I'm the Science and Data Librarian at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. Originally, I got my degree from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana in biophysics in the program there. Got a PhD at University of Wisconsin in their biophysics program. I postdoced at Johns Hopkins. And then moved out of research, mostly just following my wife. She is a professor here at Bates. And so I did some research here at Bates, then I moved to Bowdoin College and ran their cell biology and genetics labs for about 7 years. And then started here as the science librarian. And most appropriate for this panel, I think, is that I help the researchers here deal with their data, so research data management and resources that help them do that.
Excellent. So thank you all three for joining us today. And I think we're going to make some good magic happen. And I'm going to start us with the questions that we have. But again, we are not married to getting through all the questions. We may get through all of them and then start manufacturing questions. You can go off on tangents if you've got fascinating stuff to talk about. And our goal is to get the flavor of how you, within your area, in data science and machine learning, in scientific visualization, in research data management, how you work with researchers to help them do their research. So we'll start with, how do you do an intake interview with a new researcher or a new team of researchers? What are the techniques that you use in order to learn what that researcher or team of researchers is trying to accomplish, and how best to accomplish those goals? And I'll even leave the question up. I'm going to guess that it can be read out in TV land, so you'll have that to look at, but I'll make room here to make it a little smaller so that we can see your face as well. All right, so Fanny, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So usually I study a little bit before to go to the meeting, okay? I'm doing my homework to see what this group of people are doing. Particularly right now, we have so many resources in ResearchGate, in LinkedIn. Make them a friends and find out what the friends are, and learn a little bit about the topic, what they understand, how they do the research, what publications they are. So you need to do your homework. After that, you have to prepare a set of questions, like we discussed before with Henry, that to understand more about what people are doing or what they understand and how they perform. Ask questions. When you ask questions, you actually learn more than just advertise your skills. They will start with advertising your skills because they will stop listening. But at the same time, it's very tricky because you have to know the value system of your audience or the teamwork. Because like Roy Disney say, if you know the value, the decision, it's very easy to make. Because some people, like we discussed this morning, they don't know exactly, like the girl that mentioned, they don't know what they want. If you know the value, what are the values, or what are the expectations, the decisions is coming very easy. Okay, so this is very short.
But I think that's an incredibly valuable point, that find out what their value system is. Yeah, Richard.
Along the same vein of trying to find out a little bit about them, you said you do some research, going into it. Absolutely. About who they are. Would it be deemed inappropriate, so to speak, to seek out like maybe an NSF bio or something like that from this individual, so that you kind of get a little bit of an idea of who it is that you're going to talk to, and maybe they can give you some keys as to other research that they've done and what the expectations for that through other resources that they've had outside of, say, LinkedIn or something obvious to a non-researcher.
Yeah, of course, you're open to search in any possible resources, and this is actually the creativity.
Right.
Because if you learn more, you will be better prepared for the questions,
Right.
at least. So any creativity, use imagination and sources, or even ask some friends if you know this person. Yeah, because I really have a hard time to convince people because the area, machine learning, artificial intelligence, everybody right now understand in different way. So, or if you want to teach them deep learning or whatever skill is, they say, oh, this doesn't work, or I don't have enough data, or something like this. And actually, for all of us, what the future will be, and some researchers, they say that the problem that we will have will be the data, not exactly our HP facilities or cloud computing or even the algorithms. Algorithms, I mean, there are so many open source resources right now, but we will have a problem with data and people. So the social science is involved, like we discussed. Of course, how this affects economics and people without jobs. And it's a like you say, yeah, we really want to be prepared when we go to communicate and in involving people in the projects, new projects, to convince them that this will be beneficial for them too. Because many times they say, oh, we can do with statistics. I don't need more your machine learning algorithms. And we discussed this morning. We really want to be able to figure out what is the problem and what kind of hardware or software to use to resolve it.
Right. Good. So, Pete. Oh, is there a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit more about the value system that you had just touched upon?
Well, this is very philosophical. Henry will help me, but there is a psychology test. I can give you the link. So people have actually, six. There are six. I don't know if you know. The six values like growth, significance, adventure. Like changes, people like some changes, like love and relationship and family. And I don't remember the last two, but I can give you the link. They are like a questioning survey. You can do the survey. And probably everybody knows inside of you, like in the team, they should know, like the Disney, I didn't finish with the example of Roy Disney. When they create actually Walt Disney Studio, they say that our value is to create the movies that whole family will watch. And they are consistently repeating and keeping this value. So if the team knows exactly what we want to achieve, we want to achieve this biology or molecules interaction or new drugs. We want to develop a new drugs, but we don't want to have a toxicity. You know, we have a very big bioinformatics program, so we don't want a toxicity, but we want to kill the cancer. Or in image processing, what is the quality? Or speed? We want the speed, or we want the safety information. So the value for these people, for different teams, will be the different value, like what we call objectives. Yeah. So for personal stuff, our objective in life, somebody wants to be rich, somebody wants to be popular, somebody pay more attention about the family love relationship, and all of us, we actually follow all of them. Only that we order the importance in different ways. So the importance of these values is different. And when we do the projects also, we order our objectives in different ways. that probably all of them are important, but in one moment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, so I want someone to kind of put a pin in this too, because I want to come back to, after we explore the current question, I want to come back to how do you find out what their values are? What is it that they value? But you've got another follow-up question. That's okay. So I want to come back to that because I want to give that to everyone. I want everybody to chew on that, and that's going to be our question 1.5.
How to use that value system and try to get a better relationship.
Right.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, good. So, oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
That piggybacks off of the original question I had was, what kind of tools would you recommend to be able to get that?
Right, and I want to actually use that as a deep dive and get into the question of how do you discover what a particular researcher or research team values?
I referenced that NSF bio, but that doesn't go to the depth of what you.
And it probably, it'll tell you what they do, but it won't necessarily at least directly tell you what they value. And I think the question of what do they value is a really crucial one. But I want to go ahead and throw this to Pete and give him an opportunity to talk about how he does an intake interview, and we'll give Stuart the same opportunity. And then I want to come back to this because I think this is a really important question of how do you find out what it is that they value? But Pete, let's go to the intake interview question. How do you do that intake interview? How do you find out what you need to know to get started with them? And if you're talking, you're muted.
Talking and,
Uh-oh. Then we may throw it to Stuart. Stuart, you want to go ahead and answer that one?
that beats unmuted.
Yeah, I think you muted me, but that's cool. So yeah, I think it comes back to the idea of values and the research interview that we do typically at the desk, not even necessarily for data management, always comes around to the idea that people aren't necessarily sure how to ask for what they want. And so a big part of it really is listening. So I would like to echo that point, that you just ask a lot of questions and really be receptive to what they're saying so that you can try to guide them to what they're really asking about in terms of understanding what their value is. For me, for research data, a lot of times when I am brought into the project, it's really in the context of a grant frequently. And so people, their value really is in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, really about compliance with granting agencies. So I sort of know where they're coming from at a sort of primary level. But really what I try to do is convince them that a lot of the things that they would need to do for compliance are really just good things to do. Especially as we generate a lot more data, it's just not as easy to deal with data the way that we might have in the past, where you can put something in a notebook and then have a table of contents for it. The data that we work with are voluminous and really need description and narrative and context, and they need to be supported in a safe way. All those things are really important. And so sort of in that intake interview, trying to get a sense of what are the kinds of products that they're going to have from their research, and do we have resources that can actually accommodate those, or do we need to build out something else or buy something else? And you know, what kind of history or track record do they have of you know, providing this sort of narrative or context for their data so that it's valuable beyond the point of creation? Those are the kinds of things that we try to get at in these interviews, to get a sense of the scope of what they're going to need, and then trying to figure out the tools and resources that we need to apply to get them there. And it's going to be different for different disciplines. You know, in the sciences where I mostly live, a lot of our data are digital, and so at some level we're really just dealing about describing digital files. But for other disciplines, maybe they're physical objects or they're photographs of physical objects. And so the way that we need to curate those and make them available to other people and the metadata that's associated with them is different. And so getting a sense of the valuable aspects of those things is really important. So again, asking questions, listening, and trying to figure out what they value.
Great, thank you, Pete. And Stuart, you want to take that, the intake interview?
Sure. So again, our role is sort of different in that, at least most often, we're not sort of directly helping the researchers. We're kind of inviting them to a collaboration in order to try to make their stuff look good, and as part of some larger story that the researchers have. Will be giving some guidance to, but they're not the prime drivers of the story. So we might find out about the researchers by, it might come from a news article, or we might be looking at research papers when we know we're looking for example, a simulation of the neighborhood of a black hole or something like that. And then, so typically, we would set up a conference call where some of us in the visualization team, and then sometimes also the director of the show, if it's going into a show, would be talking with the researchers, and they would tell us what they do and what sort of simulations or whatever they have, and what they think is most important about them. So, and they're often pretty good at telling us in terms that are at least more or less comprehensible to us, what they think is really important. Because and this is a really crucial skill that not everyone has. So maybe we've been lucky, and this definitely seems to be it needs to be a teachable and taught skill to communicate, of the whole cloud of knowledge that you have about your field, what's important about it, or what's important about it for this purpose. So in one of these recent things, which actually involved UIUC biophysics people called Schulten's group, I don't know whether you were involved in that in biophysics, but they had been modeling photosynthesis in these bacteria that were doing photosynthesis before there were any green plants, and they knew a good deal about their processing and their behavior and how biochemistry worked in them, but they had already worked out that what they wanted to present was the chain of energy from light capture to, they had a very specific subset of all that they knew about these organisms that they wanted to be portrayed. And they'd done it before, but they wanted to work with us so that we could do sort of more artistic stuff than they had done. So often when we're going to researchers, we definitely need to ask them what is most important, and then to guide our visualizations based on what they're telling us. So maybe I'll stop with that.
Well, and I think that's a very good segue into that next question we wanted to explore. Do one thing real quick. Okay. Which is, how do you discover the researcher or research team's value system? What is it that they think is important and valuable? How do you get them to tell you that? And I'm guessing you could get some information just by asking that question straight out, but that there's more to it than that, in that they may not know how to articulate that when you first ask the question, because everybody in their discipline already knows what the value system is, and they've never had to explain it to someone outside the value system. So do you want to take that one first, Penny?
I would like to see the projects that they develop.
Okay.
Okay, some demos, some examples, classwork, something that they are proud of. Okay, when you ask person, okay, show me your best work or something that you are proud or excited, they will start showing some examples. Yes.
And along that as well, could we get them to maybe engage them as part of that intake? And I'm assuming since this is the intake, that they're left somewhere else and they're coming here.
Well, no, it could simply be that up to this point, they hadn't used the central research capability. They hadn't used your capability up to this point, but they may have been at the institution a long time.
So asking them what tools they're familiar with and getting them to show you a demonstration of how they use them.
Sure.
Yeah.
That would be fair, because then that kind of gives you a concept of how familiar they are.
Sure.
Yeah. This is maybe not only for researchers. We're doing constantly with our students or PhDs. When they come, you cannot put your PhD exactly to do something that is not familiar, you need to learn what they know and how they understand the subject, whatever is the subject. Some students complain. I agree. They want us to guide them and say, oh, you read this and use particular model or algorithm or something. No, I think it's the best way to understand what is the knowledge base or ground knowledge, and after that to put something additional, like additional algorithms or model. So this is my answer.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that. And Stuart, you want to go next?
I'm trying to think what to add to what I said before. I mean, it's helpful to, when we're talking with researchers, for us to try to reflect what we're hearing from them, and then they'll say, yeah, this and that, or I mean, it's also very helpful after we've started talking with them to go and read some of the research papers, and that might both help explain some of the things that weren't filled in the initial conversation, but also, you know, they'll write the research papers telling their peers what they think is important about what they're doing, or what they're trying to convince people of, or the problems they've solved or haven't solved. I don't know. This seems like an important question. I don't really have a good answer for it.
Not a problem. Let's switch to Pete. You want to take a shot at it?
Sure. I mean, in terms of trying to figure out what's valuable, I think it does just come out in the interview. I think, especially when you've done the asking of the questions and the listening, and you start to actually suggest solutions to the problems, you start to get a little closer to the bullseye, because the suggestions that you make may be completely appropriate, or maybe they're just so far from the mark that you need to start over. But at least it's a way of providing an example of what you can do. And then they're really, at that point, it stops becoming very general and it becomes very specific and very personal. So they start putting themselves and their work and you know, how you're going to collaborate together into a real specific example of what can happen. And then you start to get beyond the general scope of, these are the kinds of things I'm going to do. This is the overarching question. These are the kinds of things that I'll generate. And you really understand that what they want is to be able to make, at a certain point in the project, the data available to a specific group of people. And maybe early on in the project, that's just the people in their lab. And then maybe it's something that's a local consortium. And eventually it needs to go into a repository for everyone, and it needs to be done in a way that's valuable and accessible and discoverable and all of those good things. And so you can suggest ways to do that, and it's at that point where you see how they value those research products at that point in the life cycle of the research project. And so I think it's really sort of when the rubber hits the road, and you move out of the general questions and really start talking about their project specifically, that those values come out, because people spend a lot of time thinking about their research, and they have those values. And so if you say, is it like this, they're going to say yes or no, and then it's asking specific questions. But I think you can get there pretty quickly.
Thanks.
Make them excited.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because if you can observe, so this, to me, this sounds like a trick of the trade, actually. If you can observe them being excited about something or proud of something, that's immediate, strong evidence that that's something they value.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if they say, oh, I got a cover of Nature magazine out of this particular project, or I was the keynote speaker at such and so conference because of this thing. That I think you're right. I think that gives you a very good indicator of where their value system is. Good, thank you. That's great.
We have a question.
Oh yeah, question. Go ahead.
Just want to be a little bit more specific over here, because it's a new concept to me, and I hope I'm not worrying you too much about it.
No.
But I know earlier when Annie was talking about the values, she made an example of when they were trying to discover a new drug. One of the values was the toxicity that they did not want in the crop. So are there more tangible examples of the value system that you all have experienced with researchers? For example, what are some of the values that they valued, like timely, under timely manner they wanted to complete the research, or was it something a matter of pride? Well, can you all share some examples with us along those lines? I hope that makes sense.
I think that time is always the issue.
Sure, yeah. There's always deadlines.
Always deadline. So,
Oh, so the question was not being heard out in TV land? Okay. So the question was for more specific examples of kinds of values that came out in discussions during the intake interview or later on in the process. Is that?
Yeah, so then when we have the conversations, we can sometimes pick up or identify clues that might be missed in our conversation.
So you can pick up on them based on a sense of what the patterns are.
so well, I think that every type specific research will be has different values, but some are general, like a time you mentioned. So if you all of you sense this, or you call the meeting once nobody show up, or few people didn't show up, second time, third time, of course this collaborator will be out of the project. So the time and responsibility, if people are not responsible or they cannot follow the due days, yeah, so yeah, it's important for good team to work together. Some general, can you help me with this?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, there are, as you say, there's some common things, time and money,
Yeah, and money.
number one and number two, but they're the same thing. So really number one.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I think it does get pretty idiosyncratic. I think the idea of tracking their emotional attachment to a particular capability is a very good way of determining how valuable it is to them. If they get very agitated about something, in a good way or a bad way, you can very quickly determine how that maps to what their value system is. Go ahead.
And if I may, I think that's a lot of what I was talking about getting them to demonstrate, not only the tools they use, but what it is that they do. Because I don't know about other people, but I have an ability to, if I can see somebody else talking to me about something they're passionate about, I can then kind of tailor the way I talk to them about something I'm passionate about, being networking. So when I'm talking to them, you use an analogy talk to everybody as well. Well, if this researcher is talking to me and I'm making assumptions that I know what he's talking about, I can kind of gauge that there's an intelligence level maybe just a little bit above 12, especially if he's using key terminology that I use.
The trick is, it's not a matter of think of them as 12-year-olds. It's how would you explain it if I were 12?
But you can start gauging that give and take and that level during the interaction and determining some of the values. Because if they don't, if they start getting frustrated during a conversation, I'm speaking over their head. I need to back it back up. Or maybe I'm headed the wrong direction.
Right.
Kind of back up. You can start gauging those values in their value system, getting them to show you what it is that's important to them.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can see it typically in their face and their body language.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll communicate it very loudly, but not necessarily articulating it with words.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's true. All right. So I wanna pick up on the next question because I think this relates back to how do you know? So how do you learn the lingo, the terminology, and the needs of a new research discipline that you haven't worked with before?
This is kind of the same, I think, like reading or seeing examples.
Well, so one of the traps I've been caught in any number of times is thinking I know what they mean when I don't. and discovering later that so I will tell a story. So I was working with an oil reservoir simulation group in chemical engineering, and I worked with them for something like 5 years on various sub-projects. And during the first probably 2 years, I thought an oil reservoir was an underground lake of oil. And okay, so having not grown up in an energy producing state, it didn't occur to me that an oil reservoir was a giant rock with tiny little holes in it, and in the holes were the oil. I had no idea. And I was sitting one day with one of the master's students, and we were working on a thing, and I don't remember how he was explaining it, and all of a sudden, oh! Because, I mean, what did I know about oil reservoirs, right? So I had a picture in my mind for like 2 years that was completely wrong. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, what tools do we have, or what tools do each of you use to try and tease out when they're saying things in a way that means something to you, but it turns out it means something very different to them?
Okay, honestly, I like the YouTube videos a lot. Google it. Google quickly YouTube videos. I have my favorite people. I study a lot of Coursera too and NVIDIA classes, but also my recommendation is not to be stuck with your favorite, but just randomly see books and videos and variety of sources, and of course select something that you like it and it's easy to understand, and don't spend too much time.
Yeah. Pete, you want to give this one a try?
Sure. So I would say that you definitely need to do some homework, and your things that I like to look at are the previously published work, review articles in that area. And I think one of my favorite things, if I want to try to lock into what they're doing now, if I can get a hold of it, is a recent grant. That really kind of shows where they are. But I would say to get back to kind of how you were framing the question, it's just really important to be humble and really to just acknowledge that, you have certain skills as a facilitator and someone who can help them, but you are not them. There should not be an expectation that, I'm going to have like PhD level knowledge in some other field. So, as I ask questions, first I'm going to try to get things at kind of the 30,000 foot view. What is the system that you're trying to study? Because most questions can be considered sort of system level. And then, like, what's the specific question you're asking about? So if you're talking about photosynthesis, where along the energy transduction pathway are you really focusing on it? What is different about, sort of archaic organisms versus, photosynthesizing plants? And what's sort of the critical part of it and the thing that's most important to you? And I may not understand it, and I'm going to keep asking questions, but, we both need to acknowledge that you are the expert in that, and I am the expert in this. And so, we can collaborate and do something together. And so there are probably things that I know that I can help you with, and there are things that you definitely know that I may misunderstand, and it's not because I'm trying to be willfully ignorant or not doing any homework, but that there's just that possibility. And I think the humility and just, it's really helpful a lot of times to acknowledge that I'm not trying to be your peer. I'm not trying to get a name on your paper. I'm a resource for you and a facilitator. And I think that goes a long way when you can acknowledge that.
Thanks, Pete. I think that's great. Stuart, you want to have a go?
Sure. Let's see. Along with things that people have been saying already, it's continues to be helpful to keep talking back to the researchers and reflecting what you're hearing and what you think is up. Like in prepping for this, I found a diagram that I'd sent when we were talking with a guy who studies black holes, and I'd made this sort of diagram trying to understand what we were up to and is this a useful presentation. And so to some extent, it was a useful diagram, and in other respects, it was completely wrong. And he was very helpful in explaining that this was a complete misunderstanding of a black hole, or with the photosynthesis stuff that we were talking about that we've been working on recently. I'd always heard that photosynthesis meant, ended up yielding oxygen. Well, not in these creatures. They hadn't. The photosynthesizers arrived separately from the oxygen producers. So that was a misunderstanding. You were talking about language in general. We were trying to think of words that get used differently in different fields, like feedback or bias, or there's a cosmological feedback, and then there's acoustic feedback, and there's statistical bias, and how many and cosmological bias too. So it's good to have maybe a dictionary of multiply used words. And anyhow, but I love your example about the reservoir. So
good. Kyle, you want to have a go at this?
Sure, no problem. I'm Kyle Monahan, a senior data science specialist at Tufts University. I logged on a little bit late, so I apologize about that. But one of the main things that I try to do is ask a researcher or a faculty member for maybe the top 4 papers that really highlight the goal of their work. I look through those and I really try to ask the dumb questions, right? The questions that are so basic, just to confirm that I have a general idea of what they're talking about before I start to think about, okay, how do we approach this from a data point of view? How do we store the data? How do we, work with this? And the goal I always say to researchers is that I want to get what they might consider the simple questions out of the way first before I start to address things.
I think that's very helpful. That seems to fit in really well. I think we're really at a very good consensus among all of you. You're coming from very different areas, and yet I think the process is quite similar. So then how do you balance what you should teach to the researcher or team of researchers to do for themselves versus what you should do for them? Do you want to start?
Okay. I'm just thinking that when we discussed before, maybe this is related with this question too. When we communicate with different teams, we researchers, we have to be able also to take care about the acknowledge our experience, acknowledge ourselves, because otherwise the communication will be wrong if we don't not only understand the problem, but be willing. So if the partner is willing actually to communicate with us, even if we research what they do and what we offer, but if there is no willingness or acknowledgement and desire to work together, nothing will be successful. And how I balance, if we really know what they want and how we can collaborate together, I can offer my help, of course, and separate the task in small subtasks and coordinate our work.
Okay, but how do you pick between, so there's a lot of things that have to get done, for example, for them to start consuming machine learning as part of their research. How do you figure out which of those things teach them how to do and which of those things you just go ahead and do?
Yeah. Well, what I'm doing usually is have a kind of small, I cannot say course, but at least a few hours workshop to teach the basic machine learning concepts and strategy and algorithms for particular audience, usually separated in audience, because not for anybody, but for computer vision we have, for natural language processing, for video analytics. So different subjects, they are different, but most of the models are the same. So we will do some kind of overview of the concept and the models, and in the end ask people like survey what particularly they like it in this course. They have a preferences to the model and what is the task. So when we know already what is the task, we can guide them what kind of data they needed, and after that, what kind of resources like cloud performance, how many GPUs you needed for this task, or what kind of software is preferable and appropriate for resolving the problem.
Thanks. So I'm going to throw this one to Kyle too. And Kyle, so the balance between the parts where you teach them how to fish and the parts where you do the fishing for them.
Sure, that is a great way to put it. I always say that, you know, data science is 5% code, 90% communication and understanding of that code and the subsequent actions that that code will do. You know, I always say I would like to have a researcher or a faculty member leave with all the things that matter for the analysis understandable by them. You know, that they can reproduce the analysis, maybe not completely, and we'll do the mounting of the drives, the data stores, transferring the data, all those index errors they run into when they run the code, compiling problems in their initial, you know, startup. You know, we'll deal with those kind of infrastructure-based problems, but they really need to understand the scope of the analysis, why they're choosing one method versus another, and how they made that choice and why I might have directed them in that way. I think if we can get to the point where a researcher is able to understand why we made the choices we did, then we can move towards this.
Thank you. Stuart? I'm sorry, go ahead. Thought I heard someone talk. Stuart, go ahead.
Let's see. So in our case, this isn't so directly a question, but I talked with a collaborator here, one of my coworkers who's kind of being farmed out to a group that's doing this a crops in silico project. They're making multi-scale modeling of crops, and so so there it's more appropriate. Let's see. A big issue for them is that the researchers, the biologists, don't really know exactly where his skills lie, and so they might go and say something like, "We have a picture of, pictures of 10,000 soybean plants. Can you make a visualization of them?" And if they had sets of measurements of soybean plants, then he would be equipped to do that. But taking the pictures of the plants and doing something that he would make a visualization from involves skills that he doesn't have, and none of us in this group have. So I guess this might be more along the lines of the previous thing, how do groups bridge the communications gap of what the researchers and people trying to assist them, what they need and what they have available. I guess that's as close an answer as I have to this question.
Okay, thank you. And Pete?
So it's a tough question. We're at Bates, we are pretty high touch, and so it comes down to a question of resource management in a sense. And so I think it's really important to get back to Kyle's idea of like understanding the scope of it. It's important to kind of scope the project, maybe even in that intake interview or sometimes short after that, like what is it we're actually going to do? What is my part of this process and how can I facilitate you? And so if you can sort of project yourself to the end of where you're going to help them, it just makes it a lot easier for everybody to be kind of on the same page in terms of where you're going and how you can get there. But if you leave it sort of open-ended, then there's always this sort of Peter Falk kind of Columbo, like, and one more thing, and then, it just keeps being one more thing, and then you're really not facilitating, you're actually kind of a part of the team. And that's not really what you're trying to do, because that's not sustainable. You can't do that for everyone who comes to you for a project. And so really the goal is to try to you know, you've got some training wheels, and then you want to get to a point where you all agreed that now you're going to kind of go on your own. And it's not like, you know, goodbye, we're not going to work with you anymore. But, you know, everyone kind of is at an understanding that, you know, this is sort of where it goes. And I think if you can do that early and also show successful examples with their colleagues where that's the sort of thing that you've done, and believe it can happen. You know, they didn't know R before we started, and now, you know, they're able to do the statistical analysis or whatever it is. And, you know, in my case, you know, like maybe, you know, a data scheme or something that's discipline specific or something like that. Yeah, it's definitely something that we're going to work on a lot together, but this is the part where we stop. And I think if you can frame that early, it really does help.
Does the fact that typically in an academic context you're working with students play into the decision, I'm going to teach them this thing, because even though it would be quicker to just do it myself, the students are going to need to know this when they leave the institution? Does that play into the decision-making process?
Definitely. So I mean, I can't speak for others, and I don't know how much contact they have with students, but, you know, the students are a big part of my job. And so working with faculty is really important. And, you know, we have a big capstone project here at Bates, and so students are very involved in the research. Everyone does a capstone project. And education is really our focus. We're not an R1. We do, you know, we do have faculty members who go out and get research grants, NSF grants, some NIH grants, and so we do, you know, need to focus on that sort of primary research. But definitely, absolutely, you know, students come into play, and so there's definitely a difference between what you would provide for a student, understanding that, you know, they're really only going to be here for 4 years at the most as an undergraduate. You're probably only going to be working with them on a project for maybe a year at the most, probably more like a semester. And so it sort of self-scopes itself. But when you're working with faculty who are going to be here forever, presumably, you know, they're actively ongoing as scholars. You do need to figure out how to scope it and understand that, you know, this is kind of the service that we provide as facilitators. And eventually, you're going to need to understand enough to be able to sort of, you know, initiate some of these projects on your own, because you have colleagues that need this resource that's valuable to you too.
Kyle, you want to take a go at that?
Oh, I'd love to add. I agree with you, Peter. I think you made a great point. You know, for me, finding faculty and postdocs who have that experience is critical, because they'll train the entire lab. I mean, if I take someone through a process who's a postdoc and they're able to process that, you know, and understand that process, they'll train all of the undergrads, you know, all of the PhD students, and work them through that. So it's a really good way to facilitate the research by training the people who need the training and who will train others. I guess training the trainers.
And I would just add really quickly that I think that is almost essential, because you've got peers training peers, and that is just, it's just a lot easier to get the information from one person to another. I have to build a relationship, and they don't know me from Adam. They don't know what I know and who I am. But a peer that can provide that, that's huge.
Stuart, any thoughts in this area?
Yeah, maybe. What about, so you might find that, what if you find that you're the wrong collaborator for them? Like, they really should be talking to somebody else because there's a research opportunity that you can't help them with, but that you might know somebody else who could help them with. Is that a thing that you find? It's something that AJ is talking about. You know, in becoming part of this collaborative group, there are lots of directions that they could go, and the group has the, you know, whatever capacities its history led to it. You know, the capacities of the people who are in it. But sometimes, and sometimes it's easier to keep going in those same directions but sometimes it's worth saying, well, instead of only doing more like what we had already done, you should do things that none of the people in the group, including you, the facilitator person, know how to deal with. But I'll just drop that on the table.
So Fanny, what are your thoughts about that and about the teaching versus doing and the students after they finish the project, what they need to know?
Well, we have also capstone, and we actually get the capstone projects from industry. I like the approach that the problems are coming from industry. So what we want to teach them is for students that they will be prepared for future job. This is what we want from them. For the researchers, it's a little bit different. As I mentioned before, I think that examples before, what we did before, this show more than coaching.
Right.
Demos or examples, better than just coaching.
And then for Stuart's question about what if you discover that they need the help of somebody else more than they need your help?
Yeah. we have to accept the fact. We have to accept it. And actually, we know collaborators and people, and we can suggest them to contact them with somebody else.
Sure.
We
Pete?
were not so happy, but
Well,
to help them.
Yeah, right. So if your choices are you're not going to be able to give them what they need, or they go away and somebody else give them what they need, you're going to have the same outcome either way. They might as well have the good outcome.
Yes.
So Pete, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think the way I approach all of these things is that I'm a facilitator. I'm a resource, and I'm basically work for hire. So I want the best positive outcome for the people that I'm working with. And I'm trying to build a relationship so that if there's a project, another project, they're going to feel good about coming to me when it is the right interaction. And so if I get a sense, this comes back to the earlier question about like being receptive to their values. It can hurt your feelings sometimes, especially if you've invested some effort, when someone basically is clearly not interested in what you have to give them. They need something else. When you put in some effort, it's hard to cut bait sometimes, to go back to the fishing analogy. But it's important to do it, because you're not worried about that specific interaction necessarily. You're interested in kind of the long haul interaction. And again, with peers, if you've had a great interaction with someone, even if it's relaying them to someone else, and their peers ask them, well, how did you deal with this? And they say, oh, that Pete, he was fantastic. Or, oh, that Pete, he wasted about 6 months of my time. One of those things is going to have another person come and see you, and the other one is probably going to be a black hole, and that you've got to try to repair. So I think it's important to know when to cut bait, and it's actually great to get people what they need. You're a resource for that.
Yeah, well, and I think a good rule of thumb is you only get to screw them over once.
That's it.
Kyle?
Sure, I'd love to add a couple things. I basically agree with Pete. I think it's about building relationships with people, not only the people who might want your service, but the people who provide similar services. So one example I have is a little bit of it, but when it gets large scale bioinformatics, it's not my main training. So a lot of times I will provide a kind of warm handoff to our bioinformatician or to a lab that knows about bioinformatics. And so I think part of that is this idea of a warm handoff. So if I can't provide all of the service that they need, can I connect them to someone who can provide that warm handoff, build that relationship, even if it's just, oh, that Kyle, he knows who to contact to get the things I need. I'll come back to him again because, well, he couldn't help me with this package, but he knows exactly who to send me to. And kind of like Pete said, it's that positive interaction, even if it's just forwarding an email, suggesting some contacts, and suggesting a person to go to. I think it can be very positive and help build that kind of nexus, which is so important for lots of these large scale projects.
Thanks, Kyle.
Maybe questions?
Are there audience questions, or usually they're not shy about diving in? So, by the way, am I right that I have 10 more minutes, or do I have -5 more minutes? Does this run till 2:45? 3 o'clock. Oh, I got tons of time. All right. All righty, good. How did you learn to do your job? What advice would you have for someone who's getting started in the same line of work? So in machine learning, in statistics and data analysis, in scientific visualization, in each of your areas, how did you get started in research data management? How did you get started? And if someone's getting started now, what would you tell them? What do you wish you'd known when you got started, that if they knew it, they might have an easier time? Yeah, it's sort of a big compound question. So
you decided that we have time.
Yeah, if we've got time, we're gonna dig deep. All right, so Kyle, you want to try this one first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in general, my background is as an environmental engineer, so my initial training didn't contain as much stats. I went into intermediate stats and some advanced regression and a little bit of Bayesian models, but it didn't cover the breadth of stats which a PhD in stats might provide. So basically what I had to do is take a lot of advanced stats courses, 5 or 6 of them, but really the most important way that I learned to do the job that I do is just by applying it over and over and over again, and having a new faculty with a new to me 3 or 4 times a week and ask me to apply it. So that was really a helpful way to train me up very quickly.
So one of the things that we've noticed a lot in the research computing facilitation area is that when some of us who are sort of the old graying folks got started in this, we had the luxury of time to learn what the trade was, because there were very few people doing it, and so there was very limited expectation by the researchers of what we'd be able to do. And those days are over. Now when someone comes into the field, they've got to hit the ground running. They get hired and they don't get 5 years to figure out what their job is. They get 5 minutes. In the context of statistics and facilitation, and then I'll jump around to each of you and sort of fleshing out this question a bit, understanding that they've got less time to learn the trade than we did back then, what kind of help can we give them so that they can streamline the spin-up of their career?
More resources right now, Henry.
Good. So flesh that out. Let's hear about that.
Well, the resources are really bigger right now. So we have so many resources. Of course, the point that Henry mentioned, a lot of competition. Okay. Mm-hmm. And when you publish, even it's so difficult to find out something novelty, and what we expect from our students are novelty, and they think that should be a patent or something. So it's so difficult, but they have resources, they have communities right now with internet, new communities like our community. So with these resources, I think that it's helping.
Absolutely.
To find easily the answer. And of course, they need the creativity. They need to be creative to find out what is novel. And novelty, to find the novelty, and it's very, very, very difficult right now.
But I think you've hit on something really important, which is the thing that exists now that at least in our area didn't exist 20 years ago is the community. and being able to leverage the community, maybe that's a key piece of advice for someone getting into the business now. Let me throw this one to Stuart. So if someone were getting into your area now, what would you advise them to help ease that process for them?
Boy, can I plug a book? I mean, it's not my book, but and this is sort of working against what you just said, Henry, but I will say it anyway. The book, I mean, is called Discovering. It's talking about the sources of creativity in science. The author's name is Robert Scott Root Bernstein. But he has a series of imaginary conversations between like a physical chemist and a working biologist and a historian of science and a cynic and so on. And they're looking at historical, major discoveries like the understanding of osmosis or the recognition of penicillin or of vitamin C. And so over and over, the pattern is that the people who discovered these things were people who had been trained in other areas. They had different training from their peers. They had broader training, and they changed fields. And so they were prepared to say, okay, so this is probably a familiar pattern. But so the answer is just, even though it may slow down your career, do things that don't seem like they're immediately they're immediately necessary because they might turn out to be. So AJ had got connected with the Crops in Silico project because he was looking at a feature in an animation package that didn't seem like we needed it for anything, but we did. And I got, years ago in another job, involved in a project that involved building a giant geodesic earth map dome on the campus of University of Minnesota because I had been playing with polyhedral meshes. So I don't know, I will plug avoiding specialization as long as you can.
Well, I think that this is not against, this is not against what we discussed here. When I say resources, I mean multidisciplinary resources. I don't mean resources specific in the same area. We have a question.
What's the name of that? Discovery. And I'm sorry, Stuart, can you say the author again?
I'll type it in the chat also, but it's Robert Scott Root Bernstein.
Okay.
Discovering is the
Discovering.
keyword.
So can you go ahead and send that book title and author to the VR Discuss L list? And then everybody will have it.
If I know it. I'll certainly type it in the chat box here.
Yeah. Sorry, I was referring to one of the audience members.
Oh, okay.
The rest of us. Yes, I'm making someone who volunteered a question do some extra work.
This is beneficial for both sides, even when we're facilitators, so
I agree.
We learn something and the next person is learning something and that's beneficial for all of us. But what we mean resources for every area, not resources in our area.
Pete?
Let's see. So first I'll answer your question directly, and I'll just agree that there are resources that have been built up since I started. So I think the idea of research data management has been around for a while, but really kind of in its current form, probably not much more than 10 years old. People really started thinking about it around the time that funding agencies really started requiring you to have data management plans. And sort of really from inception or before inception of creation of data, thinking about how you were going to store it, secure it, make it reusable, make it discoverable, all those good things. And so even in the time that I've been in this position, it's really kind of evolved, and there are a lot of resources that you could go to, and I've got some here that I could send to you afterwards. But the New England Collaborative Data Management Curriculum, there's actually a curriculum that's been developed that is open source. You can use it, all of it, some of it, remodel it. People have really thought about how to deal with it, and I think looking at a few things like that, even if you never use any of the resources, can help you wrap your head around how people have organized the problem. So again, it's like trying to figure out what the system is, and then, you know, what are the problems you're interested in. And so there's some really sort of specific things that, for example, the NSF is going to ask for. And so if you can sort of think about how your project is going to address those things, it's very helpful. And so in a similar way, if you can look at how other people have organized it or broken down the problem, it's going to help you understand the best way for you to understand it. So that's sort of addressing the question of like how to actually be that person. But I'll now answer the question, I think, by like not answering the question and say that I really like Stuart's answer, that that there's, as things evolve, there becomes kind of this artificial archetype of what that person is. And so when someone puts out a job description after the field is kind of mature, people think that that's really the person they're going to get. But then when you go out and try to hire someone, they're not that person. And if someone's been in that job for 15 years, they've sort of grown up organically to serve a lot of different things that you're probably not going to get from someone off the street. So one thing I would say is just if you were going to go into this, understand what it is big picture, and then, you know, as Stuart was saying, just be really open to learning new things. You can't go into something like this where you need to be kind of a generalist and just be really, really laser focused on something. So if you've, you know, for those of us that have gone through and you know, had a PhD and maybe gone and done a postdoc, I mean, you become the world's expert in like the smallest little thing. And if you think you're going to be able to like spend the rest of your life spinning that small little thing when the world moves past you, you're wrong. And so, you know, just being open to things and learning new things and taking each project as a new opportunity to learn some new stuff. I think those are the things that I would tell someone coming in. There's some basic skills that you're going to need so that people want to work with you, but just know that you're going to be learning, you know, for the rest of your life. And you've got to take that as an opportunity and not as a problem.
Thanks, Pete. And Kyle, while Pete was talking, I saw you, well, either I saw you nodding vigorously in the little thumbnail image or your camera's bobbing up and down, but I'm just going to assume that there was some vigorous nodding going on there. So do you want to make a comment on that?
I am well known as a vigorous nodder, and it was definitely me.
Okay.
I've been slamming my fists down on the computer in excitement. But yes, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think I always tell people the skill that matters the most to me is that I'm interested in everything. That I really want to learn why you're taking this approach, how you decided on that approach, the other approaches that you could have taken and maybe didn't, what we could take in the future. I think each project is an opportunity to add to your knowledge, whether that be general knowledge or specific. And I think you'll never know. One of the things that I really like, never know when something will be useful. I really was into remote sensing and processing remote sensing data, and I never thought that would be useful. I just enjoyed it. I really like to process the different bands of information. It was fun. And now, of course, I do that all the time. It's much more popular for people who use that in their projects. So I think that's great. The one suggestion I want to make is to not be afraid of specializing within a project once you've gotten into it. So if there's someone who can do something maybe better than you, learn about what they do, but also don't be afraid to say, hey, maybe you'll take care of that and I'll finish this off so we can move forward. So I think knowing when to specialize and when to generalize is perhaps important.
Great, thank you. These are great answers, very helpful. Do you have an additional comment?
Yeah, I agree with all of them. So I think that even that we're here and we have different research objectives, but we accept challenges. So this is very important, okay? Accept the challenges. My personal experience, I lived in 6 countries, different countries, participated in all of these projects. They're completely different. And I like changes and new areas of research.
That's great. Okay, this is the last of the questions I came up with, but we've only got 10 minutes left, so that's about roughly perfect. So what do you find is the balance between what the researcher or the research team believes is the right way to do things versus the ideas or concepts or techniques that you're aware of but they're not aware of that could be valuable and could be a better way to do things. And I'll go ahead and start with Stuart.
Oh man. I mean, since what we're engaged in is telling stories, and we the visualizers are contributing part to that, but we have sort of two collaborating people with other ideas. So the director of the show when we're making a show, and the researchers themselves who often have an idea of what story they would like to see told and how they want it told. I brought this up as if it were a competition. It doesn't feel like a competition. We do a lot of brainstorming in more than one session, and I think that's really important. So that's all I got to say. Brainstorming is a good thing.
Great.
But settling on something is also a good thing, so we don't do it indefinitely.
Got it. Good. Kyle?
Sure. I really liked this question. I think it's excellent. I think if I explain the concepts in kind of the right way, and it's really a right concept, then I think the researcher normally understands that it's a reasonable way to do things. I think in general, my role can be very technical, and it also can be an act of persuasion, right? Of saying, hey, I've found in previous projects that this is much more efficient. Can we try this? Here's an example of us doing this. Maybe we could try this approach. And it's having that conversation, kind of like Stuart said, where we revisit something, we talk about it, and then we say, okay, we're going to go with this and try this out. So I think if I persuade a little bit and talk about what might be a better choice, people are normally pretty amenable to it.
Thanks. And Pete?
Yeah, I would agree that basically having examples of where what you're suggesting works it's better than all the words you can spend in an hour. I guess if I had to look at the pinch points for the kinds of things that I do, which are I think fairly generally applicable. So there are some areas that are very specific to a particular researcher, but in the main, a lot of the types of problems that they need to solve are pretty generalizable. But the pinch points seem to be things like either change to a long-standing process that they have. So it's not necessarily that they don't like what I'm suggesting, but it's not what they've done before. Or that they're just resistant to adding more to their workflow. I'm so busy now, I can't do this additional thing. So for example, to just sort of bring it around to coding or something that maybe might be easier for people to grab a handle on. If the old workflow was just sort of doing something by hand over and over again, and you're going to get the answer, but it's just sort of brute force, or you learn how, the syntax needed for a particular language so that you could have something do it automatically, and you just change the variables in the script, and then it comes out and it's much faster, there are no mistakes. And if you can just sort of show the value, so coming back to the value thing, of what you're suggesting, then maybe that will persuade them. But again, in the end, I'm a facilitator. I don't have an equal voice, and I don't go into it thinking that I do. So I try to be reasonable, and in some cases, maybe a little more forceful than I would be otherwise. But in the end, it's not really up to me to decide. So if they've decided to go a way that's not what I'm suggesting, I'm going to try to help them do it if I can. If it moves outside of that kind of sustainability, what will I do, what will you do, then there needs to be a hard conversation about that. And I would say as a final point, maybe what I'm suggesting is just resistance to changing my long-standing process. So maybe what they're asking for is totally reasonable, and I've got to do some additional work. But in the end, it's as good or better, and I need to be open to that too.
Great, thanks, Pete.
Yeah, what I learned from all of this is that it's not always only necessary to have our professional skills, but we need to have a lot of communication skills. So there are thousands of seminars, even how to do the brainstorm or how to perceive information. So there are books from marketing, there are books like Seller Was Sold or something like this for develop communicational skills.
And I think I agree. And I think if I were to summarize what we've heard over the last hour and a half, each of these different areas has very different technical skills and background, but the way that we go about facilitating, all of this sounds like it applies across the board for these various kinds of facilitation, which is in some sense a relief. I wasn't sure how this panel was going to play out and where there was going to be, oh, well, what you do is so different from what we do that it doesn't really match very well. What I've heard in the last hour and a half is that it matches extremely well, that I'm not going to go all the way to saying, well, facilitation is facilitation regardless of what area it is. I'm sure there are exceptions, but I think what we've heard here is in the areas that we've looked at, there's far more in common than there are differences, except the technical issues that you deal with. So I'm very excited about that. Yes, Richard.
So along those lines, and I'm fixing to back up and just ask the most dumb question.
Go wild.
As a researcher being trained up in a particular discipline, in any discipline, is there any sort of training on the tools that researcher would use to do that job?
So as a researcher is being trained from the beginning, so here we're talking primarily about students getting research training.
Normal training in MATLAB or Minitab or any of these.
Is there a common set of tools within that area that they need to have experience and understanding in order to be successful?
Yes, there are tools. Like we discussed before, how to use the GitHub, how to use the cloud computing, how to use,
Not specifically, like if I know I'm going to need to use MATLAB.
Yeah,
there
are workshops for MATLAB. Yeah.
Some of that we are integrated. So the reason why I'm asking is because, and this again, I'm coming from a pure IT perspective. As a systems administrator, that boundary was predefined that I will build the server, I will do a base install of the application, but I'm lost when it comes to like how to configure specific to your needs.
Right. So I think the answer turns out to be more complicated in the context of research because again, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be research.
But you understand that's what
sure, absolutely, and I think the reality is in the context of research, it's there are tools that you need to use, but those tools evolve over time. And the question you had about, well, if they need a specific tool within a specific discipline, is there training or education provided around that? And I think the answer is it depends on the institution and the discipline within the institution. There are not hard and fast answers to those questions.
And the software provider also, the company,
yeah.
They also support you with teaching tools and workshop, whatever is the provider.
Right. I'll go to Carlisle and then Mike. Oh, sorry, Stuart, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple things. So here, and I'm not sure how many other places are doing similar things, there's a computational science and engineering sort of specialization that, so people doing, for example, material science or physics or something like that can go into the CSE thing and then take, along with the courses in their own domain, they would also be studying computational science, not only on a single product, of course, but the whole suite of things that you need to be a capable worker in using HPC or a cloud or whatever it might be. So So that's getting integrated into academics. And the other kind of thing that I think is kind of cool that I know only a little about is for people doing computer work is the software carpentry movement.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe others know more about it than this, but I want to make those pointers at least. Yeah. Thank you.
Just
Thank you.
had that in our previous.
Thanks, Kyle.
There are so many certificates and program and classes free. You just ask what you needed, because there are so many resources that are available and people don't know. They're free.
Yeah. Carlo?
So one of the things I found is important is doing self-documentation, particularly in the context of installing software and systems like that.
Yeah.
Because frequently somebody will come back and say, you remember that thing you did for me 4 or 5 years ago? Could you do it again, but add
Right.
something? And if I haven't written it down, then I don't.
So self-documentation because things come back at random times. Good. Were there other questions? Yes.
Would anyone on the panel be willing to volunteer a situation with a researcher that turned sour and how they extricated themselves out?
Okay, so can you tell an unhappy story about how things went horribly wrong with a researcher you were working with and how you resolved it? And yeah, no names. And we're gonna have to keep it a little short because we're actually at a minute over the end of our time, but we're in break, so we've got a little cushion here. Otherwise, is this break 15 minutes or 30? Oh, good. So it's gonna become 20. So if y'all don't mind staying a few extra minutes and tell like one horror story each.
It doesn't work.
Do you have like
No, I didn't,
a story where you were working with some researchers and the experience with the researchers or the relationship with the researchers or what you were doing with them went horribly bad and what you did about that? And I do have one, but I'll go last. I actually have many, but I have one in mind. And if you want, I can go to the
no,
other folks.
No, I don't.
Okay, Kyle, do you have one?
Sure. I remember I was working on a large distributed data set. They were using Python. I had let them know that their code was not actually iterating correctly, and it would just go through and delete all the files in their directory and not replace them with anything. And I let them know, like, this is going to take forever and delete all the files. And, we have backups, so that's okay. But, this is going to delete them. So please don't run this. And they're like, no, I'd really like to run it. I was like, okay, we can try. I mean, I'm okay with that. It's just going to be a day or two before we can get them back. And so, of course, we ran it. It deleted the files. Everything was on fire kind of moment. And, of course, we brought them back, and it was fine. But I think, it was actually a great learning experience, as frightened as I was at the time, because I hate when we lose data. I really am very protective of my data. At the same time, I think it was a great experience for the whole lab group. And so the horror story was.
Thanks. That's a great one. Pete, you got any?
I don't want to be that guy that's like, it's never gone wrong. And I'm sure that I definitely have mental scars, but I just can't bring one up. I don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for the most part, what I do is not dangerous enough to cause that kind of animosity.
Stuart, you got one?
Maybe an embarrassing thing, when we're undertaking collaborations to show people's work well, then if we talk to them, it's awkward and sometimes really quite awkward if we end up not using what we talked about. So there's someone who does galaxy collision simulations who was, I think this is probably 20 years ago, but I think she's still mad that she went through some series of discussions with us and we didn't end up showing what she offered. And there's more like that, but yes, it's embarrassing to do half a collaboration and then stop.
Yeah. Do you have one? Or okay, I definitely do. So this is early 2000s, and we got a small grant for a small cluster of a very specific flavor, and We had a very small crew at the time. I can't remember whether you were here when we had the Itanium 2 cluster.
It was my job.
Okay, so, and because we had like the proper full-blown system that was the priority, it took quite some time to get the small sort of boutique system into production. Well, one of the faculty had brought in a grant that had some hardware money and went to the VP for research and said, will you give me some matching funds so I can get even more hardware, because that's what I really need to do this research. And the VP for research said yes, but only if you go in on that specialized cluster that I've already put some cost share money into because of the grant that paid for it. And so the faculty member agreed to that and bought, I think, 2 or 3 additional condominium compute nodes for that system at a very significant price. And then it was a long time before he could use it, and he sent me, I think, a series of blistering hate mails about how I had wasted his money and ruined his research, and it was quite substantial. And in the middle of this, it got, the tone of the emails got to be rather strident, and this was one of the people that I had to say, if we can't have a civil conversation, then we can't have a conversation. And to his credit, he returned to doing civil conversation. And the way I resolved it was I did not resolve that problem. Eventually he got going on the thing, but there was a lot of lag before he was able to be productive with his money. Instead, I solved a completely different problem for him that had been plaguing him for a while, and ever since then he loves me. So the fact that I couldn't solve the original problem was okay if I could give him good value somewhere else. And I think we are a good bit over our time already, so I think let's wrap it up here, and let's thank our panel for a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Stuart and Pete and Kyle and Fanny, thank you very, very much. We're going to take a break. And, oh, I got to stop recording, and we'll be back at 3:30. Is that correct?
Yes.
And 3:30 is which panel? What is the topic?
How to help researchers pick the right thing.
How to help researchers pick the right resources. So that's very timely. Thank you all. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.